Quite often, owners create a board not for the benefit of the business but for themselves.
The top manager role is essentially fulfilled by the owner. He concentrates the entire decision-making system in his own hands, which in reality means that no real decision-making system exists.
In your opinion, what should be done to avoid falling into this trap?
You cannot prevent an owner from making mistakes with their own money.
When businesses are highly diversified, is it better to establish separate boards or keep everything under one umbrella?
Quite often, such situations eventually turn into a real thriller.
Trust needs to be built.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today, together with Irina Papusha, we continue our series of episodes dedicated to board failures. If you watched the first episode of this series, you may recall that we emphasized how important it is to learn not only from positive experiences and best practices, but also to examine and analyze the mistakes made in establishing and operating boards. This allows us to draw conclusions, adjust our work, and take those lessons into account.
Last time, we also mentioned the phenomenon known as the survivorship bias, when only the most successful cases are analyzed, while those that, so to speak, did not survive are completely overlooked. In business terms, this happens when examples of successful companies are highlighted, while the businesses that never took off are forgotten. I would like to give an example that is currently common in discussions about the education system. People often refer to Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, who dropped out of traditional academic education, started businesses, and became some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. However, no one talks about the many people who did the same and achieved nothing. In other words, we want to talk about blind spots, mistakes, and those stories that rarely receive attention, but from which we can definitely learn.
Today, joining us as experts are our colleagues Natalia Palina and Alexander Pochkun. Colleagues, good afternoon.
Greetings.
Greetings.
The case I would like to discuss today is one I find myself encountering from time to time. Essentially, it looks like this. An owner or several owners want to establish a board and introduce corporate governance in their company. They are approaching me. I conduct a certain level of research to understand the strategic objectives in order to design the board's composition. I also analyze the different business units that are involved in the company's operations. After that, the board is established and so on. However, from time to time, a situation arises where some of the business units within the company are, in fact, highly independent businesses that operate almost separately from the core company for which the board was originally created. There are also cases when it turns out that, in addition to the company for which the owners intended to establish a board, there is actually a whole group of companies owned by the same shareholders, and the owners assume that this entire group of companies should automatically fall within the board's scope. This creates a certain challenge. On the one hand, the board that was initially formed and its composition may not be adequate for the specific needs of the other businesses. On the other hand, if the same board continues to serve additional businesses, it requires a significantly greater time commitment from the board members, because instead of overseeing one board, they suddenly find themselves serving 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. In your opinion, what should be done to avoid falling into this trap?
In my experience, I haven't personally encountered this exact situation, but recently I had a conversation with the owners of a fairly large business. Looking at their structure, it would indeed be possible to view it as several separate businesses. And of course, if those businesses are not integrated into a single P&L and are not considered interconnected in any way, then their governance should also be completely separate. However, if the businesses are interconnected and, for example, there is a model in which one business can become a natural extension of another, then the situation changes. For instance, today private education has become very popular, along with additional services that are launched to support the broader industry and strengthen the core business in the long term. In that case, because it directly impacts investment priorities, hiring priorities for qualified talent, and the ability to attract external expertise, it is essential to first align and clearly discuss the governance model with the owners before any board structure is formally created.
In my practice, this actually happens quite often. I mostly work with private companies, often family-owned businesses, and a lot depends on who initiates the creation of the board. Because when the initiative to establish a board comes from management, the company whose management proposes creating such a governance body to the owner effectively becomes the single unified entity within the board's scope of responsibility. When the initiative comes from the owner, often the owner tries to include everything possible within the board's scope. Quite often, owners create a board not for the business, but for themselves. When a board is created for the owner personally, they naturally try to extract the maximum benefit from it. As a result, various elements begin to be pulled into not even components of the core business, but rather different investments that the owner has made. And it may seem to them that if these assets exist within one holding structure that contains all their investments, they mistakenly perceive it as a single business. Although in reality, these businesses are often completely unrelated to one another. Therefore, it is very important for the chair of the board and the board members to clearly define the boundaries of the board's responsibility, why it is being created, and what its specific mandate is. Because in reality, this person, this owner with multiple businesses may actually need to establish not a board for the largest company in their portfolio, but rather a board for an investment company through which they conduct their investment activities. But that is a completely different story.
Such situations occur quite often, regardless of whether it is a large company, a diversified holding, or an SME that is simply very diversified and operates across multiple business directions. But here we should return to the point that Alexander partially has already mentioned. Is this the owner's board? And for example, the owner may effectively be operating as a true family office. That family office may already be formally established or may still be informal, but what truly interests the owner is investment decisions, prioritization, and the strategic development of all their businesses. In that case, it becomes the owner's board. It is no longer really a supervisory board, but rather more of an advisory structure. In other words, we work directly with the owner on the development of their overall financial capital. If we are talking about a company board, we also need to clarify whether it is one large core business with several smaller additional businesses that are not as developed as the main one, or if these are truly equal businesses. In that case, the question arises whether there is a management company above them and what the overall governance model for all these businesses actually is. You asked how such situations can be prevented. How to understand the situation. Before establishing a board, it is important to do some preparatory work, either with consultants who specialize in setting up boards, or just with corporate governance consultants, or with a prospective chair who can help structure the board. This so-called trial period should take some time, at least a month, and ideally up to 3 months, depending on the situation. During this time, all the company's documents should be reviewed, first and foremost the P&L statements, as Natalia rightly pointed out. It is also essential to understand the company's governance structure. Only after understanding how the governance structure is built can an appropriate model be proposed.
And this type of situation may arise not only at the stage of creating the board, but also later. Once the board has already been established and has started working, the board may come to the conclusion that the business needs to be restructured, effectively separating 2 or more business lines. For instance, there was a real case from practice where a company engaged in trading a particular product while also acting as a regional distributor of that product across Ukraine. And from time to time, the incentives and motivations in trading, they were in conflict with distribution. As a result, a decision was made to split the business into 2 parts. A trading company that would focus exclusively on trading and a distribution company that would focus solely on distribution. Going forward, these companies could either continue cooperating commercially or work with different suppliers and partners. The board effectively became a board overseeing 2 separate businesses. And naturally, this requires separate board meetings and an additional time commitment. What should be done in situations like this?
In reality, there is no universal solution because in your example, the businesses are quite synergistic. In other words, there is a certain vertical integration aimed at increasing the overall profitability of the business and at using the same financial resource to deepen or expand the margins of the business as a whole. Naturally, in such situations, when within one company or even within one business, 2 separate segments emerge with different margin structures, many conflicts arise. For example, why aren't you selling our product? Or why should we buy from you at this particular price? And so on. One possible solution in such situations is indeed to separate them into two different businesses. However, in practice, this kind of situation is also regulated by accounting and reporting standards. Because in this case, we are essentially dealing with two different business segments, which in financial reporting should ideally be reflected as if each were a separate business. Therefore, in this situation, the board's task is rather to determine how to clearly separate these areas of responsibility and profitability and to ensure that neither segment becomes dependent on the other or tries to exert commercial pressure on it. Therefore, in this case, I can see two possible paths. The simpler one is to separate them. That is, to split them into two independent businesses. Although human connections will still remain, and the influence of the owners will very often continue to exist, because the problem is often not in the businesses themselves or in their management teams, but rather in the owners. The second option is to build a governance system that clearly delineates these boundaries. However, this would be a more complex challenge for the board. I have encountered situations like this before where there were 3 or even 4 stages of vertical integration, from agriculture and livestock farming to production and retail, essentially what is often described as from field to table. And in most cases, the problems are always the same. How do you allocate the overall margin or profit among the different business segments?
My experience shows that when business units are highly interconnected and truly synergistic, creating 2 or 3 separate boards for each direction is not an effective approach. These businesses are not independent, they are structurally and operationally dependent on one another and need to function as a single coordinated system. In such cases, it is better to build a system of very close cooperation while ensuring that each business can grow independently and remain profitable. When we encountered a similar situation, we recommended establishing an executive board of directors, or what is often referred to as a management board. When the heads of these business units sit on the same management board and must reach a joint decision, they are effectively required to negotiate. They have to negotiate both in the interest of their own business and in the interest of the overall decision. In that case, the supervisory board works with the executive board and does not need to dive deeply into each individual business. But this approach works specifically in the case of synergistic interdependent businesses. If the business directions are completely diversified, there may be different governance models, but that is the next question, and I will return to it.
I'd like to continue the arena's point. I believe that when there is a strong connection between businesses, it is important to ensure that the executive teams are structured in accordance with the strategic requirements of each business and that they operate separately. At the same time, a 2-tier corporate governance system should be implemented, unified under a single supervisory board. In fact, if we look at large global international companies such as Nestlé or Mondelez International, they operate across hundreds of geographies and dozens of business lines, all overseen by a single supervisory board. Even when they consider certain businesses as standalone units, for example, digitalization and direct-to-consumer D2C initiatives have significantly changed how companies view their business models. By building the right executive structure, it is still possible to keep everything under one board and maximize the benefits by setting the right investment priorities.
In reality, in such situations, there is often an internal competition between divisions, like not even for margin or profit, but for the owner's attention. Quite often, these situations turn into a psychological thriller, and the board ultimately has to resolve it. In fact, the smaller the company and the closer middle management is to the owner, the higher the risk of such situations arising. Unfortunately, they are almost typical for many businesses in Ukraine.
Yes, unfortunately, it is a very familiar situation. This is business the Ukrainian way. It often happens when the executive team does not want anyone between them and the owner because they are used to working directly with the owner. But I would also like to talk about businesses that are highly diversified. And to address your question about what should be done in such cases, should separate boards be created or should everything remain under a single umbrella? If separate boards are created, then there will be no overarching board because one board cannot report to another unless it is an executive board. At the same time, it may be the case that each business direction has its own supervisory or advisory board. And within the family office, the owner simply has personal advisors who provide recommendations regarding future development and investments. On the other hand, there is a model that I personally find very appealing where one-tier boards are established within each business unit. These boards include executive directors and 1 to 3 independent members who also sit on the
Supervisory board.
essentially the same individuals. However, within those one-tier boards, they act as independent directors. This allows them to gain a deeper understanding of each business. Then, during the meetings of the supervisory board, they can present this information in a much more informed and detailed way.
Have you encountered situations where the terms of board member compensation somehow define the scope of their work, and accordingly, if that scope expands, the board member's compensation is adjusted as well?
Yes, such situations have occurred more than once, as I already mentioned earlier. But to be honest, the solution to this situation lies not in increasing compensation or fees. The real solution may instead lie in establishing a separate board for the additional company or business. When we talk about diversification of a business is not the same as business integration. Diversification is actually the opposite, because businesses diversify in order not to depend on a single source of revenue, and so on. In fact, these can be businesses that are completely different in nature. Sometimes companies try to squeeze all of this into one consolidated group, which is actually a mistake and can become a problem for the development of those businesses. If these are fundamentally different businesses, let's say, for example, agriculture and banking, of course, the owner may formally hold the ownership rights at the top through some kind of holding structure, but does that really mean that both businesses should have the same board? If we see that these businesses are not integrated, that there is no real sense in preparing consolidated reporting for them, and that they have different business natures requiring different approaches to governance and decision-making, then it is usually better to recommend that the owner establish a separate board. Although even then, it is worth carefully assessing the situation. If the other part of the business is significantly smaller, it might not even need a board yet. Perhaps it would be enough to establish proper reporting, monitor its performance, and observe how it develops. And if it continues to grow, it can simply develop until it reaches the stage where a board actually becomes necessary. We can easily fall into the trap of thinking that if we are paid more, we will somehow gain more competence or resources to oversee a non-core or completely different business within the same board. I believe this is a mistake because it leads to a loss of focus. We start confusing the requirements that may be completely different for each of these businesses. So even though all of us want to earn more, I would not recommend taking that approach. What does happen sometimes is that in vertically integrated businesses, the workload becomes so large that the board simply cannot function effectively within a single day. In some companies, board meetings last 2 days. In such cases, we usually request a review of the compensation. If the management team cannot structure the board agenda so that it can be addressed within 1 day, or if the owner needs more time to process things, which often happens because they dive into details that are not critical to the business, or simply because they enjoy long discussions, then it makes sense to increase compensation. After all, as the saying goes, for your money, any request can be accommodated. You can talk for 3 days if you wish, but independent board members should be compensated for that time, although the work tends to become less effective.
In my personal experience, there was a case where the owner of a fairly large but integrated business began discussing with me his intention to eventually move toward a system of corporate governance. And I asked for a business review in order to look at the numbers, the dynamics, and the challenges the business had faced. And then, after we reviewed the core business, a series of additional questions started to emerge. I also have this idea. I also have this small startup that hasn't yet become a real business, and there's also something else. At that point, you need the courage to simply separate these things, because otherwise it will bring neither satisfaction nor results, either for the people who will be working on the board or for the owners. Instead, it will create a negative experience, which is exactly what should be avoided.
I would agree with Natalia here and add that if an owner approaches you about establishing a board and you see that they have various interests that go beyond the mandate and competencies of that board, you can simply suggest becoming their advisor. acting as their personal advisor on issues that are not directly related to the activities of the core business. That would be much better both for the owner and for the company. And in principle, your work will still be compensated. In addition to the enjoyment of communicating with an interesting and entrepreneurial person, you receive financial compensation for contributing to their personal development. Because this is not about the business, it's about the individual.
By the way, I have encountered a situation where an owner consciously said that he wanted a board. Not even exactly consultants, but rather intelligent people with whom he could have conversations, while also receiving advice. We suggested forming a council that would include a diverse group of people, ranging from philosophers to business leaders. Essentially became a kind of discussion club for the owner and his advisors, people he could use as sounding boards, a place where he could draw inspiration and ideas. At the same time, we created a supervisory board that worked directly with management and the owner and performed its proper governance functions. This can actually be a solution for owners who enjoy discussions. And this is quite a common situation. But returning to the issue of compensation, first of all, there must be transparency from both sides. From the owner's side, it is important that they disclose everything from the very beginning, even those small side projects they may have, because they're important. Otherwise, we won't be able to account for them later. And secondly, when the board begins its work, an agreement is concluded with each board member. And this agreement usually specifies the number of hours, including the maximum number of hours, which covers the duration of meetings, their frequency, and the total number of committees. It defines if the board meetings will last a full day, 2 days, or a couple of hours. All of this is best determined from the very beginning. And here I would strongly support Alexander's point that simply increasing time or workload is definitely not a path to greater efficiency. On the contrary, I support the principle that less is more. It is better to focus on using the allocated time more effectively. In my view, boards that manage to stay within the designated timeframes tend to work much more efficiently. They find common ways to communicate concisely, logically, and clearly, to reach decisions, adopt them, and then monitor their implementation. So it's really about clear communication upfront and effective execution afterward.
Returning to the idea of creating advisory boards or boards of directors alongside a joint supervisory board, looking at it from a slightly different perspective and revisiting Alexander's example of a bank and an agribusiness within the same business group. Could such a business have a supervisory board with 2 committees, one for banking and another for agribusiness?
I can start because we had experience with this. It wasn't a separate function-specific committee, but existing committees were assigned to certain topics to focus on one area of the business and then another. But we must remember that committees do not make decisions. Committees can only prepare and develop proposals for the supervisory board. This means that these issues do not reach the supervisory board every time or at every meeting, but perhaps only once a quarter. Because first of all, the committee is working on one business, then another, then a third. Whether it is an operational or strategic committee, its proposals might reach the board at most once per quarter, at best once every 6 months for a given business. And this also most often ends up at the supervisory board level. In other words, the consistency of the approach is significantly disrupted. Honestly, we tried this as one of the options to find a way out of such a situation, but I would not recommend pursuing this path because it did not prove effective.
Allow me to continue. Anything is possible. It could work. You know, around 20 years ago, when I was first learning about corporate governance, the mantra was that corporate governance is based on best practices. Today, the reality is that there are no universal best practices because every business is unique. What doesn't work in one business might work perfectly in another. So what would I recommend paying attention to? How comparable are they? For example, if you have a bank with a capitalization of several billion hryvnias and an agribusiness with a land bank of 10,000 hectares, it probably shouldn't even be on the same board. In theory, the businesses should be reasonably comparable. Although I agree that for such businesses it might be far more effective to have separate supervisory or advisory boards. From the perspective of finances, this wouldn't be material for either business. Clearly, if we're talking about a fourth-tier bank at the bottom of the national banks list, one that should have long been closed, and an agribusiness with 10,000 hectares, perhaps these businesses don't even need a board at all. The bank, of course, would require supervision, but that's a separate issue in this case.
I would also add that it depends on the business. In our repeated example, we have a bank and an agribusiness, while there could be others. But let's remember that the bank operates in a highly regulated sector where the state is very active and corporate governance in the financial sector is tightly regulated. That means any supervisory board overseeing the bank must follow the rules established by the state. Other businesses, however, may not be subject to these rules. Conversely, there could be a business line that's even publicly listed, which would come with a completely different set of requirements, and so on. For example, joint stock companies are regulated under the law on joint stock companies, so it's important to assess which lines of business the company actually operates. On the other hand, I would also like to raise a point regarding flexibility. What works in one company may not work in another. During our discussion, I just remembered the late 90s and early 2000s when marketing in Ukraine was roughly in the same position as corporate governance is today. It was a hot topic, everyone said it was important, but very few knew what it entailed. I was among the very first marketing graduates in the country, and I remember that those who joined international companies immediately entered a marketing-savvy environment and began working effectively because the companies already understood what marketing was and why it mattered, and how to implement that marketing, and what to expect from students who came in with this knowledge. Those who ended up in Ukrainian companies initially had to explain to management and owners why their function was needed. Even with vacancies, it was not immediate. Professionals had to sell themselves first and prove why the role was necessary. For example, marketers had to justify why marketing is needed at all. Today it may sound obvious, just like the idea of a supervisory board, but at the time they had to convince companies that it would significantly benefit their business. In the same way, early marketing professionals often found themselves in companies only after they successfully demonstrated this value. But during interviews, everyone heard something different. The student, recent graduate, would explain what they had learned, but the owner would think, great, I'll have someone buying, selling, making tea, cooking, and doing everything else. The owner would say, of course, come and do whatever you want. A few months later, the marketer would present a marketing research plan, promotion strategies, and other initiatives. The owner would gradually realize that they weren't prepared for this, particularly because it required additional budget allocation. The owner didn't really need or want all of it. This created the following situation. Either the marketing specialist might think, no, this doesn't really work for me, I'll move to another company, or the owner might quickly realize that they do not actually need such a highly educated and expensive coffee maker. A third scenario is when the marketer says, all right, I'll probably stay here for a while. I'll gain some experience in the process and then I'll move on to another company where things might be better. This brings us to the question of flexibility versus rigidity, or whether one should simply follow how things are meant to work. One option is to stay and agree to everything the owner wants. Another is to educate the owner about what proper marketing and corporate governance look like and try to implement them correctly. Or one might simply refuse to accept such an approach and look for another board. The reality is that flexibility does not always work when the bicycle has already been invented for you. You need to get on that bicycle and ride. You should follow what exists and is established in corporate governance. Natalka is smiling because she also comes from a marketing.
And I'm smiling because I understand the challenges you're referring to, Irina. In fact, there are many examples where an owner's reluctance to move toward a marketing-centric strategy becomes a real obstacle. Because moving a logo from the right corner to the left corner of a layout is not marketing. That could just as easily be done by the person who was making coffee yesterday. But developing strategies that truly place the customer at the center and building the entire system around the customer experience, the product, the client, and the company's reputation, that is professional work. It requires new inputs, a deep understanding of the market, and much more. And all of that requires investment from the owner, which they are not always ready to make. The same situation exists with corporate governance. Therefore, when we talk about flexibility and adaptability, I believe it is critically important to demonstrate that adaptability during the conversation stage, when you have not yet reached an agreement with the owners about what exactly they want and how they envision it. At that point, it is essential to be as adaptive as possible in order to hear and understand the starting point the owner is currently at. How they see the organization as a whole, the operational side of the business, and how they envision the strategy. Only then can you assess whether and how quickly and in how many stages you can realistically move toward implementing proper corporate governance.
I assume that business owners also approach you asking for help in establishing a board, and you probably have a set of questions you use for preliminary research or due diligence before creating a board. What key areas do those questions typically cover?
For me, it is important to understand the structure of the business, including the legal structure I would be working with, how the company's financial reporting is prepared and what components it consists of, who the people are, the top management of the business, because these are the individuals the board will have to work with. Especially when the company is relatively small, it is also necessary to assess its financial capacity to actually afford to maintain a board. Because frankly, in some situations, this becomes more of a fashionable trend. Sometimes an owner expects a miracle simply from creating a board, an advisory board, for example. This happens in cases where there is no regulatory requirement to establish a supervisory board or governance body. In such situations, when the board is not truly needed, it often becomes purely formal. That is a different story. Therefore, it is important for me to understand whether the company is financially capable of properly funding board services. I also need to understand the owner's personal objective in establishing the board and how the company's CEO views this. If the CEO is a different person, if the owner and the CEO are the same person and they ask to establish an advisory board for themselves, that is usually a disaster because it becomes difficult to work in that setup. You cannot really limit an owner's right to make mistakes with their own money.
I am concerned with whom the board will actually be working with. I mean the top management, whether it even exists. If we are talking about SMEs, this becomes a critical issue. Quite often you enter a company where there is middle management but no real top management. In practice, all top management functions are performed by the CEO, who is also the owner. In other words, one person accumulates the entire decision-making system. And that means that a real decision-making system simply does not exist. There is just one person on whom everything depends. For me, that is a clear red flag. In such cases, a board cannot function properly. There is simply nothing for it to do. Then there are legal questions. First, ownership structure, how many owners there are, what their respective shares are, and how they make decisions among themselves. Second, the legal structure of the businesses themselves and how all these entities are interconnected. Next come the financial aspects and the financial reporting itself. After that, the reporting system more broadly, not only documentation, but also the system of meetings, sessions, and reporting processes. I have seen situations where a board starts being perceived simply as a convenient tool for holding operational meetings. Because previously they never met, never reported to each other, and never discussed anything. Then suddenly a board is introduced. Owners start using this instrument in a way that ultimately undermines the board itself. But these are just the minimum preliminary hygiene checks. The most important step for me is to conduct a strategic session with the owner. First of all, I try to understand what the owner actually wants as a person, not even as an entrepreneur. What they want in life, what they aspire to, how they see themselves in 5 or 10 years, what they want for their family, and whether the family shares that same vision. In other words, I try to build a picture in my mind of the kinds of issues that may arise in the board in the future. Because in practice, it will either be a very coordinated collaboration, or there will be a constant tug of war between co-owners, or even within the family if it is a family business. After that, we start discussing ambitions regarding the business itself and the strategic vision, what the current strategy is. This is what Natalia was referring to, but more importantly, how they see the future. Do they want to sell the business? Do they want to step away from it and pass it on to their heirs or to a hired CEO? Do they want to continue investing in it or perhaps buy out the shares of their co-owners? In other words, there are many fundamentally different ways the business might evolve. Then we go deeper into products, markets, pricing segments, and so on. Once I have a clear picture of what the owners expect in the long term, only then do we decide if a board is actually needed. If it is, then we determine what kind of board it should be. What kind of questions do you include in your checklist?
I continuously update that checklist after every board I work with or help establish by adding new questions. In my view, the key issues, especially when a business has multiple owners, relate to aligning the perspectives of those owners. In fact, before creating a board, you often have to act as a kind of mediator between them. The goal is to synchronize their views and bring them together around a shared strategic objective. As for the other questions, I fully agree with you. They are extremely important and must be taken into account when establishing a board.
Today we have heard many useful and diverse insights, but let's try to wrap things up with a brief summary. If corporate directors find themselves in a situation where they initially agreed to serve on a board, whether advisory or supervisory, for a single business, but later discover that there are actually multiple businesses involved, and the board either needs to expand or be replicated across several companies, what single piece of final advice would you like to give for dealing with such a situation?
I would say that the key is to build trust. If the owner trusts you, they will listen and try to understand your perspective. That is why trust, from day one, gradually strengthening over time, is, in my view, the fundamental basis for resolving this and many other challenges that may arise.
I would say the following. There is one key piece of advice. Learn to say no. Respect yourself, and when something is not what you originally agreed to, you need to find the strength to refuse what you never signed up for. To a large extent, this depends on how independent you are from that particular opportunity. Independence gives you confidence.
You took the words right out of my mouth because that was exactly the advice I wanted to give. It largely depends on the maturity of the corporate director and on their genuine independence, and whether they are willing to make compromises that may ultimately mean violating certain principles, from corporate governance standards to the agreements that were made at the beginning. At the same time, I would like to add that boards themselves can and should evolve. They are not fixed structures that can never change. If we initially joined one board but later see that the business requires different solutions, those can certainly be proposed. However, we should not rush into them the way we may have rushed at the beginning, without assigning blame. Instead, for the next steps, we need to take the time to study the situation in depth. How many boards are actually needed? Is one enough? Or should there in fact be several? And what structure should they have? Should it be a 1-tier or 2-tier or an umbrella board structure? The key point is that the decision must be more well considered. Development is always possible, and it is absolutely appropriate to propose more effective solutions for the situation that has emerged. And what would your advice be?
I believe that trust and communication with the owners are truly critical. Whether you continue working in the same board configuration or in a different one with the same owner largely depends on that mutual trust. Because trust works both ways. It is not only about the owner trusting a particular corporate director, but also about the director trusting the owner, and about proper communication.
Thank you.
Colleagues, thank you very much
Thanks to you.
for the interesting conversation, for the exchange, for the very useful and interesting insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We wish your project great success. May it continue to grow and develop. We will be happy to stay in touch and continue the conversation in the future.
This was already the second episode of our discussion series about mistakes that occur in corporate governance. We called this series Corporate Governance Fuck-Ups or Boardroom Fuck-Ups. We plan to continue this series going forward. There will be more discussions and analyses of other interesting situations and case studies, so we look forward to seeing you at our next sessions. You are also welcome to submit your own cases.
In the description under this video, there will be an email address where you can send your proposals, whether it's case studies or examples of boardroom mistakes you've encountered, for us to review and discuss. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you on our channel.